This is Tante Belle Cose, a podcast about the many beautiful things for you to discover in Italy. My name is Danielle O'Terry. I'm a writer and the founder of Feast Travel, Arthur Avenue Food Tours, and Cilento Food Tours. Last week, I helped one of my Italian relatives harvest olives. Giovanni is in his early 70s, and he reflected on how he remembered when women collected olives entirely by hand, and they would place them in the folds of these giant aprons. We discussed this while watching the workers use these giant weed whackers to knock all of the olives off the tree. And then Giovanni said something really wise. He has many wise things to say. I call him my Italian Yoda. He said, "We're no longer at the end of an era. We're firmly at the beginning of a new, very long era, and changes are happening that we can't even imagine. But we're also still at this point where we can look back and see how people have lived for centuries, especially in these small villages around southern Italy. And they are very much worth looking back at because they have so much to teach us." So here's my suggestion for you. For your next trip to Italy, pick a small village close to wherever you already plan to be, north or south, a place where people have lived for hundreds of years, and go there, preferably in the evening or on the weekend. The way you should visit is just to be aware, to notice, to wander, and to experience it as it is. Open yourself up to noticing. And I promise it will be a deeply rewarding experience. Now, among my favorite small villages in Italy is Trentinara. It's in the Cilento National Park, not far from the temples of Paestum and not far from the beach. But it's just high enough up in the hills to be its own little world. I spent the summer of 2021 there, and at that time it was when travel was just beginning to resume after COVID. It was still a very restricted time, and I had such a deep appreciation for fresh air. I would sit in the main piazza that's called the Terrace of Infinity and just look out at the sea and appreciate the breeze. Now, historically, locals have always gone there on the hottest days of the year just to enjoy that breeze. It wafts off of the sea, and it gets cooled down by the green carpet of trees that line the mountains. Also in the basements of Trentinara, there's a lot of excellent salumi that's curing because of that breeze. So, do you want to take a walk around the village with me? Let's go. Andiamo. First thing I notice is the wood smoke smell. So there must be a pizzeria that's getting ready for dinner service. It's like 4 o'clock right now. So now would be the time to start getting that oven nice and hot. What's amazing about these small towns is, you're sort of like in this little warren of streets. Everything's sort of tightly knotted together, sort of like imagine like two hands clasped together with the fingers interlocking. But then every once in a while you kind of like pass over a little outlook and you see this like amazing view. Also, I just got freaked out. I saw something sitting on the roof of a building that was huge, but it's a cat. I don't know what I thought it was, but I wasn't expecting a cat to be there. Yeah, that wood smoke smells amazing. Historically speaking, Trentinara would have always smelled like that beautiful wood smoke. The town is known for its bread ovens, and many of them today are being restored. The whole area is very proud of its agrarian, peasant roots. There are lots of fields nearby where farmers are growing grain that doesn't seem to bother people who have gluten intolerance, because the land in these remote hills hasn't been monocropped to death. It's still rich with vitamins and minerals, and the wheat itself is cultivated in a way that's not designed for the industrial process. It's actually much more well-suited to the human digestive process. Very often you'll notice, like here I'm staring at an arch of brick, and that was most certainly an oven, a bread oven that would have been closed up at one time. This town in particular was famous for bread ovens, and there are several around town that have been restored or cleaned up. And the way that bread would work is that it would be passed around throughout the village. So there's never an issue of the yeast dying. If you were making bread tomorrow, I'll give you the yeast. You'll make the bread. They'll pass it on to the next person, and the yeast continues going around the village, always in motion. And people would use these communal bread ovens. So these little stone lanes are so beautiful. You see little bridges that connect the houses. This is called Via Forno Antico. So we know that this is the street of the old oven. I mean, you can go to a museum, and you certainly should. Or you could just come to a small town. All right, here's one of my pet peeves. When people start talking about why carbs are bad for you, and they go, well, when we were cavemen, we didn't eat carbs. We used to just tear deers apart limb from limb and eat straight protein. People ate nothing but bread for like most of human civilization thus far. I'm not saying you need to eat bread all the time. I'm just saying there's a lot that's happened with bread since we were cavemen. And we know a lot more about what people did with bread than what we did when we were supposed cavemen. All right, that's the end of my rant on that one. Hello, doggy. People have just come out of church. There's the person who drives the ape with this dog in the front seat. The dog looks like he's driving. If you look at the facade of the church, it's all been redone recently. It's very smooth and clean looking. And then if you look above the door, you'll see the date 1714. And then writing above that in Latin, but in very crude, just handwriting, really, like not anything more professionally inscribed. And I love instances like that. You could just see like the humbleness that accompanies true spirituality. One of the most important parts of visiting a small town is to go inside the churches. If you go in the evening, they should be open. And here's the way you should think about them. Churches were designed to be like little mini kingdoms of heaven on earth, even in a small, tiny village. And so the idea is once you cross the threshold, you leave behind the outside world and you enter this mystical space. And it's quiet, it's made of stone, usually it smells good, and everything there is designed to bring about a mystical experience. Now, we're used to images jumping around on a screen and telling us what they want us to know. But if you can put yourself in the mindset of somebody who's never seen a television, never seen a screen with images moving, the statues, the paintings, the altar, the stone itself would be animated with stories. And you could sit there and have a contemplative experience. So really, I just invite you to walk inside one of these churches, take your hat off if you're wearing one, sit down, kneel, even if you're not religious, just to put yourself in the experience that people have had in that structure for hundreds of years. I feel very grounded. I feel very centered. I can feel the energy. I can feel the gravity on my body in this space. There's also right here this gate around the area that leads to below the church, and it was always the practice that bodies were placed below the church after their corpses had completely decomposed. The bones would be removed. And that's still the practice. And then they would put the bones underneath the church. So underneath every one of these old churches are a lot of bones. You know, another thing about being a visitor in one of these small towns before you come, they're all uphill. And that's because these places were really designed for all the things that we completely take for granted. Drainage, plumbing, heating and cooling. I know my dog has a talent that if there's a car coming, she decides that she should stand right in front of it, and that will be the best tech. Okay. Yeah, shake that off. Not a good idea. I mean, flooding is such an issue now, right? I mean, it's a conversation that's wrapped in with climate change. And while that is, of course, a major issue that we're all facing, also we're not designing places anymore to accommodate things like drainage. We just keep building to accommodate our comfort. And these small towns are kind of not often comfortable. I mean, you're always walking up or downhill. Sometimes walking downhill is more challenging than uphill, especially if the roads, if the cobblestones, the stones are a little bit wet. So many small towns today have been adapted and readapted many times. But often if you start looking at the actual systems, and if you're kind of a technically minded person, you may notice these things right away. These towns really were designed to battle and deal with the elements. And everybody would be clustered together so that they could share resources, and then they would leave the village daily to go work in the fields. But they returned to town because that was the most practical way to live. And it's a really excellent ecological solution. So I think there's so much wisdom in these small towns for people who are studying sustainability. And at the very least, take some of the wisdom from the past to build better because we cannot continue living in a way where we just prioritize comfort over the practical needs of our daily existence on this planet. And speaking of comfort and practicality, there is a wash basin in a small town near Trentinara that always humbles me. It's a giant wash basin where all the women used to bring their laundry, and women were using those basins as recently as the 1960s. You'll see how the edges are sort of grooved and point inward so that people could scrub their clothes along the ridges. And in some ways, I think it must have been kind of beautiful every day to go down to the sinks and see the other women of the village there and work and talk. But then also I think about how much I hate doing laundry, how much I complain and procrastinate, and how ridiculous that is. I have a washing machine and a dryer. All I have to do is put it in a box and everything comes out perfect. So sometimes these little reminders from small towns, just how difficult everything was. And maybe I shouldn't even say difficult, just the way things were, how much work it took just to stay warm or cool or to stay clean. I think it's an important lesson, at least for me. There's a lot of houses being restored here. I'm here on this beautiful terrace that was not so long ago just kind of like a big raw open garden with an amazing view of the Tyrrhenian Sea overlooking mountains. I mean, just the most spectacular view. But now it's a private house, brand new, or all refurbished. I heard that it was the Monsignor's house at one point because was connected to the church, and it looks like there's some new construction going on right next to it. It's really beautiful. Kind of the best of both worlds, living in a beautiful small town, amazing view, and then also a lot of modern comforts. This is the House Hunters International dream house right here. Okay, I know exactly what you're thinking. You're wondering if Trentinara is one of the towns that has one of those €1 house programs. And no, it doesn't. This beautiful house I was looking at is an investment of somebody who used to live here, who grew up here, and has come back. Now, those programs, I've got very mixed feelings about them. Those programs are in towns that are usually in very remote areas. I believe the first one started in Sambuca, Sicily. And what you get for your €1 is usually just the shell of a home, and then it takes several $100,000 to restore it. Now, the thing is, you have to really want to build a house, and you also have to commit to living in a small town. These places are not near Florence, Venice, or Rome. And also, there often isn't much of a local life anymore. So if you're really into home renovation, I think it's a good idea. But also, I'm not a fan of investments that only come from outside the community. I think the programs are well-intentioned. But what's great about Trentinara is that the revitalization of this small town has come from within. One of the things you'll notice when you're here too is how clean the air smells, how green it smells. If you really pay attention, you can notice the different flowers and the different trees. And I don't know, I'm no expert, but there's apps to help you identify them if you really want to know. But you know what? Sometimes you don't need to know. You can just enjoy it. Just notice it. I kind of think that's enough a lot of the time. The van that takes the zip liners back to the starting place has just come into the piazza. I'm watching this guy get out of this car that's this beautiful blue color. It's an old Fiat, and it's called Palinuro Blue. It's named for the blue grotto that's in the same area, Cilento, that I feel like I probably shouldn't tell anybody about. Because it's the largest blue grotto in Europe. It's way bigger and more beautiful than the one in Capri, but nobody seems to know about it, and it's always empty. But it was really popular at one time in the 60s, and Fiat made a Palinuro Blue car, and this guy in town still has one. When you wander around small villages, the exterior will usually have some access for cars, and there may be little cars that are able to squeak through the lanes. But as you get closer to the center, the streets should be entirely pedestrianized, and this is where you can really start looking up and down each of the alleys and finding little details. So this is the place to notice flower pots, terracotta tiles, images of saints that might be on the walls. Certainly lots more cats, plenty more dogs that may bark at you when you go by. This is really where you feel like you've entered another world that belongs to the past.
We are very close to Paulino. Just past a sign that said 50 passi, 50 passi to Paulino, which is this little wine bar that's right in the center of all of these little stone alleys and lanes. It's like entering another dimension where all the dreams that you have of the old world are actually real.
And right then, I turned off the little microphone I had in my pocket because I ran into Donato, the owner of Paulino, and we began chatting. He was setting up for the evening. Now, this is the most wonderful wine bar in all of Italy, in my opinion. And I guess I haven't been to all of the wine bars in Italy, but I just can't imagine any place being better than this. What they do is set up a wine bar in the lanes in the very center of the historic district. And there are just crates and pillows and old wine barrels. Donato also works in the wine industry, so he has a lot of fabulous things on his list. And along with the wine, there's salumi and cheese. There's this lovely truffle honey, and they actually have some for sale, so you can take it home if you like. And his wife, Rosaria, makes the most delicious meatballs. I am always dreaming about those when I go back to the United States. But perhaps the most special thing about Paulino is how popular it is with young people throughout the area. Now, there's a lot of talk about how young people are leaving southern Italy because of a lack of opportunity, but it doesn't seem like that if you're at Paulino on a Friday night. You're in this small village and it is packed with young people. That's because Trentinara has been very smart about revitalizing itself, not with tourism from abroad, but with local tourism. Because Italians who live in cities or in the nearby towns, which are very modern, which were built in the 50s and the 60s, they are just as nostalgic for these small little villages as people are abroad. They wish that they could go back and live some version of the life that their grandparents lived in these small villages. And while life in Rome or Milan might be glamorous and fun, it's expensive and it's difficult sometimes, and it can be very disconnected. And the very architecture of these small villages is all about connection. It's something that you really feel when you visit small villages. It's the most special thing about them. So how do you go about finding one of these small villages? What I would suggest is to ask somebody, like a hotel concierge, a taxi driver, or a tour guide, and ask them specifically which is their favorite small town. Now, there are some obvious touristic answers. So, for example, if you're staying in Florence, Siena will seem like an obvious choice. But honestly, it's a little too touristy. You want to ask a local where they would go for lunch with their family on Sunday. Now, their answer, hopefully, is a place that you have never heard of. Maybe it's a place that they're from, or it's a place that they like to go with their friends and family. And here's another important thing to know. You need to visit these small villages in the late afternoon or evening, or on the weekends. During the middle of the day, there is not much going on, and there is rarely much shopping in these small villages. Things are closed, kids are in school, and people who still live in the village are probably at work in an office somewhere outside of it. So go in the evening when people are coming home and kids are kicking soccer balls around the piazza, and people are going out for an aperitivo. And in the small towns that have good restaurants and wine bars, they will certainly be busiest on the weekend. Now, if you hear about one that has a particularly good restaurant, make a reservation for Sunday lunch. And that's how you can experience life among other Italian families. Another resource is a website called the Borghi più Belli, and I will link to this on the show notes. The Italian government has a program to try to promote travel to these beautiful small villages, and so the villages actually apply for this designation. They have to meet certain requirements, and so the local communities are invested in bringing more tourists there. The website has lots of small towns, and it will describe what's there, so what you can do is look at the villages that are closest to where you'll be staying and see if any of those really appeal to you. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of walking around a small village with me. It's truly one of my favorite things to do when I'm in Italy. Now, I love being in the big cities. I'm recording this right now in Naples, and I can't wait to go spend the entire day in the Archaeological Museum. But I could also say that my time in small villages is just as enriching and educational and inspiring as being inside of a museum. So if you'd like to continue the discussion with me and with others about which small towns to visit, you can join our subscriber community. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and you hit the subscribe link, and please do, that's not actually part of our subscriber community, but it helps me a lot, so please do that. But if you go to Substack, the home of this podcast, and join the subscriber community for just $8 a month, you can ask me whatever question you have, and I will personally answer. I hope you'll join us. Thank you so much for listening.